This meeting is being recorded.
All right. So first, I'd just like to apologize for my informality, but instead of wearing a collared shirt, I decided to wear my solidarity shirt today, that I got in honor of this occasion. So it's not collared, but it's a solidarity shirt. So, anyways, give me 1 second here. Okay, so welcome everyone. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, great. So my name is Nathan Silverstein. I'm the founder and president of the Polish Club at the University of Texas at Austin. Before I begin the introduction, I'm required by UT Austin's policies regarding student organizations to read the following disclaimer. Tonight's event is being hosted by the Polish Club at UT, a registered student organization. This is not an event sponsored by the University of Texas at Austin. The views expressed tonight are of the student organization / invited guest speaker and do not represent the views of the university or its officers. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors this evening. Joining us tonight is the Polish American Council of Texas, the Polish Heritage Center, UT's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, UT's Center for European Studies, and UT's Students for Central and Eastern Europe. We thank you all for being here. With that said, I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, Ms. Shana Penn. Shana is the executive director of Taube Philanthropies in the San Francisco Bay Area, a visiting scholar at the Graduate Theological Union Center for Jewish Studies in Berkeley, and vice consul of the Republic of Poland in San Francisco. She earned her master's degree in European Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Her award-winning book, Solidarity's Secret: The Women Who Defeated Communism in Poland, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2005 and as Sekret Solidarności by Foxhole Publishers in 2014. Solidarity's Secret received the 2005 Best Book in East Central European Gender Studies by the American Association of Women in Slavic Studies, part of the Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. She is the author of several books, including Gender Politics and Everyday Life in State Socialist Eastern and Central Europe, co-edited with Jill Massino. Her articles and book chapters appear in, among others, the Routledge International Handbook of Gender in Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia, New Eastern Europe, Krytyka Polityczna, and Gazeta Wyborcza. Shana was decorated with the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland in 2013 for her scholarship on the role of women in the Solidarity movement, her outstanding contribution to the development of Polish-Jewish dialogue, and her advocacy on behalf of Poland's inclusion in the visa waiver program. In 2021, Shana received the Medal of Gratitude from the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk for pioneering research on the role of women in the Solidarity movement and in introducing democracy in Poland. Tonight, Shana will be delivering a speech entitled Wildcard: Gender's Tactical Uses and Misuses in Poland's Anti-Communist Opposition Movement Solidarność. In it, Shana will discuss her book, Solidarity's Secret: The Women Who Defeated Communism in Poland, focusing on how oppositionists manipulated gender conventions to disarm the communist system, while ultimately returning to traditional gender assumptions in the wake of their 1989 democratic victory. These tactics and assumptions find precedence in anti-Nazi resistant efforts during the German occupation of Poland and in late 19th century underground activism against Tsarist rule during the partition era. She will also discuss with us the excitement of studying a recent past whose revelations influence present-day Polish society, touching on themes such as activist history and recent events such as the Czarny protest. Before we start tonight's event, I would like to provide everyone with a brief roadmap of how the event will proceed. Shana will speak for 45 to 50 minutes. She will then take Q&A for 10 to 15 minutes. Q&A will be open, meaning that anyone will be free to ask Shana questions. I will call on attendees using the raise hand feature over Zoom on a first come, first served basis. With that said, it is my distinct privilege to welcome Ms. Shana Penn.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be back. And today I'm going to give a more formal presentation than at our last meeting. And I'd also like to draw more from the voices of the women whom I interviewed. So I get a sense of who they were at the time of the interviews in the early 90s. Voice is, bringing voice into a narrative, especially a new narrative, is very important. And I might have mentioned the last time we met that while there were many instances where women active in solidarity shared the same recollections, there were also points of departure or points of tension in their interpretations of their experiences. And those usually revolved around the importance and value of of what they did, what they accomplished, and were they leaders? If they were leaders, what kind of leaders? Um, were they sad that they weren't invited to be more directly involved politically after 1989, so forth. Okay, so, well, every country has its national myths. And in Poland, during the years of anti-communist opposition from the 1950s into the 1980s, the national myth centered around the muscular, mustachioed working class heroes who created solidarity. It was, as you know, the first and only independent trade union movement in the entire bloc. And within a few short months of its August 1980 founding, Solidarity's membership quickly grew to 10 million strong, 10 million adults, out of a population of 40 million. And half of those members were women, and it was a ratio proportionate with women's participation in the labor force at that time. And while women were 50% represented, nonetheless, women were underrepresented in Solidarity's political leadership. Less than 8% of the national leadership was female. And in addition, women's interests as workers and the managers of their households were only marginally represented in Solidarity's political agenda. So why? There were a number of questions that, including the why, that guided my first research trip to Poland in 1990, and those included: if the movement's leadership and political agenda were male-dominated, well, what ways, if at all, did women participate? Were there special issues or activities to which they gravitated? Did they demonstrate special organizing styles? Were there unsung heroines among them, or any forgotten events? Or was their membership merely nominal? Where were the women? So I found little evidence of women's experiences in the published works on the Polish opposition that had been produced between the 1970s and early 90s. I mean, there was Timothy Garton. So, for example, Timothy Garton-Ash and Lawrence Weskler only barely paid attention to women, mainly in the role of certain women in the Gdańsk shipyard strikes. But beyond that, only a handful of texts seriously considered opposition roles played by women, considered gender dynamics in the opposition, and so forth. And those authors, those historians who did look at women were Barbara Yonkar, Sharon Wolczyk, and later Padrea Kenny in the late 90s. So as a result, though women participated in the workers' strikes, they were aggressively excluded from engaging in the consolidation of power after the strikes were won. And that was women's fate, not only in 1980 with Solidarity, but again in 89 at the roundtable talks that led to the dismantling of communism and the formation of the first democratic government. Solidarity was male turf, to paraphrase historian Padrea Kenny in his seminal article, The Gender of Resistance. We talked about him a little last time. The most important political dramas, wrote Kenny, were located in the male-dominated factories and shipyards where opposition activists and the Communist Party locked horns in a struggle over similar masculine values and language about power, politics, women, and who would claim the working class hero and the workers' state as its own icons and turf. The dominant images of opposition were of men striking, men being gunned down by police, men kneeling in prayer, men negotiating with male party officials. Lech Wałęsa, and I know you had the opportunity to meet with him, and other male activists became known as the founding fathers of Polish democracy. But were there founding mothers too? And if so, how would I find them? When I began my research, there was no, we have to remember back in the early 90s, there was no public discourse on gender in Poland yet, except for the communist rhetoric about women's emancipation that no one trusted. They felt that communism had discredited gender equality. So my exclusive focus on women actually didn't make sense to most people from whom I requested interviews. Because their notion was we were all in this together, men and women alike. We were all treated equally. We were equally oppressed. And so sometimes my interviews would start with having to deconstruct and kind of break down that notion that we were all equally oppressed. There were similarities in how men and women were oppressed by the state, but there were differences as well. It had to do with glass ceilings and feminized labor and masculinized labor and on and on. So initially, it wasn't easy for me to understand the culture's treatment of women's activism. The dominant feminine images that were being portrayed were not of women leaping over tractors, but instead of women weeping, women carrying shopping bags filled with bread to the striking factory sites, women standing outside the factory gates, peering in between the slats and throwing bread over the walls to feed the male strikers. Our good girls, wrote solidarity theorist Jacek Kuran. Women were expected to behave like the iconic Matka Polka, the Polish mother, who sacrifices her own life to support her men and her nation. We'll talk about the Matka Polka icon in a few minutes. Through my early interviews with solidarity activists conducted between 1990 to 92, I happened upon a different narrative about women's activism that upended the prevailing story. I discovered that after martial law was imposed in December 1981, solidarity women organized the nation into an underground resistance movement. Women organized the underground structures, hid the male leaders, and published the main solidarity newspaper, providing continuity to a movement that was in danger of extinction. They were not good girls. They had no time for weeping. There was a crisis and women were giving the orders. As Barbara Labuda from Wrocław, a key organizer there of Solidarity there, told me in 1991, "You've come to learn about Solidarity women. I will tell you the truth, but who will let you publish it? Everyone in Poland knows that women started the underground, but no one cares to talk about it. It was our national secret, our open secret." So that secret, that story goes like this. 1981, Solidarity was young and powerful. In the eyes of the Polish Communist Party, it had to be stopped. On December 13th, 1981, the government declared martial law and arrested some 10,000 activists, primarily men, in the first week. Most of the male leadership was rounded up that weekend in Gdańsk, where they had assembled for a national conference. It was called one of the most cunning military coups in history to that point. The few male leaders who were not arrested went into hiding. Well, who was hiding the men, and who filled the leadership vacuum? In Warsaw, the nation's capital, a group of 7 women met in the first days of martial law and plotted how to rescue the crippled movement. They were all editors and publishers of the opposition press. Some had been working together at an independent newswire service between 80 for 16 months, called the Solidarity Press Agency, or AS, and which they had founded as soon as Solidarity had been legalized in 1980. Some were old friends who had met in high school or university. Their activism together spanned a decade. They trusted each other, and they were all trained to function under repressive conditions. In their 20s and 30s at the time of martial law, 1 was a wife and mother, 3 were single mothers, and 3 were single with or without significant others. When police swept through their community and arrested most of Solidarity's leadership, these women filled a vacuum. Their names are Helena Łuczywo, Eva Kulik, Joanna Szczęsna, Anna Doljuk, Anna Bikont, Zofia Bidlinska, and Małgorzata Pawlicka, and they're all still living and active. Eva Kulik, who was only 22 years old at the time of martial law, told me in an interview, the underground varied in structure depending on the region. Warsaw was very feminine. Women started the central structure of the underground there. I remember the first meeting. It was a meeting of women. We invented the whole idea of how to organize the underground, how to build it, how to run it. The center was built by women. Not the factory committees, which were organized afterwards and run by men, but the center, which was built around the women from the independent press. Their mission was to preserve the voice and authority of solidarity as it had existed in the legal phase, to prevent its disappearance, using, and I'm quoting Helena Vucevo, every constructive means possible. Helena was called the mastermind of the underground. Zofia Bilinska, another editor, said it was simple. The movement had to be recaptured. We knew what to do, so we did it. The group made a plan to manage the safety of the male leaders in hiding so that they could continue to represent the movement. And they decided to publish a newspaper because the leaders needed a platform from which their words could be heard. That newspaper, Tygodnik Mazowsza, Regional Weekly, became the voice of solidarity during the underground years of the 80s. Its weekly print run of up to 80,000 copies was all done secretly, illegally, and without the use of real editorial offices, real printing houses, real distribution centers, and sometimes even without real ink. Without Tygodnik Mazowsza, wrote emigre activist Irena Grudzinska-Gross, the underground could not have existed. It was a forum in which political opinions and declarations could be made. It was a sign of stability, a link among people in finding sympathizers in a dangerous time when people were dispirited. By the end of our work at Tygodnik Mazowsza, we were the most modern newspaper in Eastern Europe, even though we were an underground newspaper, insisted Anna Bikant. I don't mean that we were the most important underground paper, but of all newspapers in the Eastern Bloc. Its editorial team, who together with their typewriters switched hideouts every few weeks, had immediately found the formula for how to respond to the political and human disaster created by martial law. They realized quickly that martial law would not be a time for spectacular action, for mass protests, for strikes. With martial law, they understood that solidarity was going to enter the long, slow period when a revolution gestates. Helena Vucevo said, she was the editor-in-chief, we created a patient revolution, the kind that women are best suited to organize. Helena, as I said, the mastermind of the underground, today manages, she's retired, but she went on to manage a multimedia empire that includes Gazeta Wyborcza and Agora PL. No one could have guessed in the 1980s that by creating an underground resistance movement, Helena would be honing prodigious business skills that would transform her into one of the most powerful, wealthiest people in Poland post-1989. Within 2 months' time, by February 1st, the first issue of the women's newspaper was published, and their underground network was making contact with other parts of the country. The courage, brilliance, and fierceness of these women cannot be underestimated. They were not good girls. They picked up the reins of the crippled movement and put the elected male leaders forward publicly, while they worked visibly behind the scenes in order to avoid arrest and imprisonment. Invisibility was a tactical move on their part, and it was highly effective. So effective, perhaps too effective, as they would eventually realize at the end of the underground. So who were these 20 and 30-something-year-olds, and what kind of gender consciousness did they have? During the 80s, they called themselves the Damska Grupa Operacyjna, the Ladies Operational Unit, or simply DGO. It was a takeoff on police operational units that they were making fun of. And it was also an expression of their sisterhood, of having created an all-female cabal. It was the clearest symbol of gender awareness that I had seen. They had left their children in the care of their parents, some separated from their male partners, and they lived together under cramped, crowded conditions, switching hideouts every month or so, sharing living quarters, sharing political dreams and tactics and confidences. We were like sisters, said Anna Bikant. It was a great adventure in friendship. Our close friendships were like those men have when they go off to war, said male-identified Helena. Their gender identity as an all-female team did not, however, lead them to a gender analysis of the political reality in which they were living. None of the 7 in Warsaw went that far, and they quickly stopped using the DGO as a means of formal identification in, for example, the signing of communications, because they rightfully feared it could unmask them and their whereabouts. So their main gender identity as the DGO remained private knowledge and took me years to uncover. Their friends called them the dark circles because they worked day and night, they never slept, and all had dark circles under their eyes. Bringing democracy to Poland, after all, was not a 9-to-5 job. Other women with whom they worked were proud and intrigued by them, and without the recollections told me by other women who stressed their importance, I may have never come upon their story. In fact, it's said by historians such as John Connolly at UC Berkeley that if I hadn't recorded these stories immediately after the Iron Curtain collapsed, that these women might have never had the opportunity to tell them, and the story would have remained lost to history. And we can talk a little later about why that might be so. The 7 women organized other women to serve as couriers, typists, smugglers, distributors, and generally all-purpose conspirators. They organized housing networks to hide the men, to hide the print production, and to hide themselves. They had, in effect, moved solidarity indoors into the home. And according to Polish women tradition, women ruled the home. So in this way, a women's network unwittingly developed, and the DGO were able to persist for close to 8 years, evading arrest, hiding in ever-changing apartments, often leaving their children in the care of their parents, as I said, working around the clock with the help of their network of women to keep the spirit of solidarity alive. Barbara Labuda, very active in Wrocław, the only feminist among these women because she had studied in Paris in the 1970s and had been exposed to French feminism. So she was the first person to open my eyes to the political importance of women's activism. She underscored that without women, solidarity would probably not have survived or achieved its democratic victory. Partly this is because the secret police and the militia were mainly searching for the men behind the newspaper's bylines. They were not actively hunting down women, and the women editors, in turn, were well aware that the communists underestimated the female prowess. In fact, according to Joanna Szczęsna, one of the editors, women exploited this oversight to their advantage by using the female stereotype of the good Polish mother, the Matka Polka, to camouflage their activism. They smuggled petitions and manifestos between cities by stuffing the papers under their dresses and feigning pregnancy when in transit. Do you hear my dog? Can you hear my dog whining? Okay, good. They concealed stacks of newspapers inside washing machines or under refrigerators. In other words, wherever they thought the police would not think to look. Anna Doljic recalled, "The police treated me like an ordinary housewife, and I thought to myself, let them think that way. It will be safer." Sexism became the wild card to their success. So, and this is where we look at what women will do in the absence of men. It's a running theme in 19th century and 20th century Polish history, and in other comparable histories. But what women will do in the absence of their men is what they've always done, we shall see. And that's fill in for men who are off to war or imprisoned or by the Tsar or Stalin or Hitler, sent off to Siberia, whatever. And for example, the secret police in Warsaw, this is a story told to me by Anna Szczęsna, rarely, we're not likely to suspect older women in their 60s and 70s. I tell you, I'm in my 60s now. I don't think of myself as an older woman, but they did not suspect older women of passing messages among conspirators. They had forgotten that 40 years earlier, these same women had acted as couriers in the anti-Nazi resistance. Sometimes when making public approaches, the Solidarity women, the younger women, would disguise themselves in fancy dresses, high heels, and makeup, and as I said, stuff their bellies with samizdat or bibuła to appear pregnant. The pregnant woman personified the Matka Polka, the Polish mother, who selflessly protected her nation and selflessly died for it. She has a long history. Polish women have been part of national resistance movements going back to the 1831 uprising against the Tsar. In 1863, the historian Edward Wolinowicz wrote, Polish women are sensitive, self-sacrificing, passionate patriots who always led in all the demonstrations and pulled youth after them. They smuggled literature, hid weapons, and then they hid the partisans. One had the impression that most of the men were so politically inept or hypnotized that they reacted too little to the female lead, and women among them, us with youth in tow, decided about everything. Pretty incredible quote from the 1860s. Polish history, for those of you who don't know, begins sometime in the 10th century with the baptism of King Mieszko I in the Latin Rite. For the next 10 centuries, Catholicism and nationhood became intertwined. Adam Mickiewicz, the revered 19th century Romantic poet, wrote that the Poles are the Christs of nations who suffer humanity's burdens in the struggle for their national independence. The Black Madonna has been Poland's icon of protection since 1655, when a battle was won in her name. The monastery at Jasna Góra in eastern Poland, known as the Bright Mountain, had been overtaken by invading Swedish armies. Several hundred Polish soldiers and monks fought off 8,000 enemy soldiers. The monks declared their victory a miracle. The Virgin of Jasna Góra, the Black Madonna, had protected the monastery. She was the queen of the crown of Poland. And King John Kazimierz, when he returned from exile, had declared her the queen of the crown of Poland. Lech Wałęsa is said to always wear a tiny picture of the Black Madonna pinned to his shirt collar in the 80s. After receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 84, Wałęsa placed the award in the monastery at Jasna Góra. The Black Madonna's example suffused the lives of Polish women. In the 19th century, stories were told of Polish women smuggling food and clothing into Russian prisons, operating secret networks across Poland, and following husbands to Siberia. In the 20th century, chilling anti-Nazi sagas tell of young girls running messages through Warsaw sewers and women swimming across the Vistula River at night to contact the Soviet army encamped on the opposite shores. Martial law perpetuated this old tradition. At Sunday Mass, women used to sing anti-government verses, Lord, give us our free homeland back. In defiance of the Communist Party, all ages used to flock to public squares where they would arrange flowers in the shape of crosses. If the police came and trampled the flowers, the women would then make new crosses, not to be deterred. According to Joanna Stęsna, the links between Catholicism and Polish nationalism may have ruled out feminism. Polish society already had well-established roles for women and men, she wrote. Women were not allowed to lead. Instead, those women whose husbands had been arrested or were also hiding underground, they played a traditional role to help them. It's a highly valued role in our culture. Joanna indicated that many married women saw themselves as wives of persecuted activists and not as activists themselves. At least they did not view that themselves as activists as their primary identities. In addition, Joanna described the underground as a safe haven for women. With most of the men arrested, there was little competition for the key activist roles. It was safe because women didn't have to compete with men, because that's just in terms of the social norm, women do not compete with men. But additionally, and quite interestingly to me, the underground was not a valued sphere. It's because men were not able to be as active in the underground as they were in when life was in the independent sphere. Joanna wrote, its clandestine operations precluded public recognition, which men needed more than women. Joanna didn't fault the terms in which Polish women were able to assume powerful roles. Her ability to differentiate between gender roles stopped short of critical analysis, though, and of an alternative vision. Because she didn't depict women's role in the underground as problematic, it's therefore not necessary to. It wasn't necessary for her to search for any solutions to the dynamic. The Warsaw-based women had created intimate friendships, much like those engendered among men at war. Let me just move on here. But their most important contribution and achievement was as editors of the most popular and influential opposition press. And yes, men eventually joined the editorial team, but it was these 7 women who immediately took responsibility for the political crisis, grabbed the reins, and got the newspaper up and running in less than 2 months' time. By feeding information to the population and to us in the West, via their contacts with the Western media, they succeeded in breaking the government's monopoly control of information. And as we can see, an independent press is crucial to the health of a democratic society. Irena Grudzinska-Gross said, it was a symbol of civic life and of solidarity's staying power. According to Timothy Garton Ash, solidarity was a tele-revolution, not just a trade union movement. It was also a tele-revolution because it was able to quickly circulate reliable news and information that mobilized, educated, and uplifted millions of people. Women were at the center of the tele-revolution, although Timothy Garton Ash failed to report this fact. Well, not only did the DGO publish the most important opposition press in the communist era, but after the communist government stepped down in '89, they went on to found Gazeta Wyborcza, with Helena leading the way. And that was the first independent national news daily in Poland, and in fact, the first independent press in all of the then crumbling Eastern Bloc. So I call these women the founding mothers of Poland's free press. Their careers as opposition media editors began in the mid-'70s. Helena edited Robotnik and Joanna edited Bulletin Informacja. They got together in September '80 and set up the newswire service Oz and built up a network of contacts around the country, which served them very well when they went underground. And their influence grew in sync with the rise of the media and its power. They institutionalized themselves over time as a group of women managing a very powerful institution, the press. And as these women discovered, there was power in the press and power in numbers. No woman could stand on her own in and of herself, and certainly not for long. Women can only have power when we pretend not to have any, said one of the activists to me. So that helps explain why it happened that when Solidarity's heroes and heroines stepped forth to celebrate their victory over communism in 1989, only men garnered recognition. Women's contributions were not acknowledged or rewarded for another 10 years. Women's tactic of invisibility had backfired, and they remained invisible even when it was safe to come out of hiding and celebrate their success. And that's why Labuda called this a national secret. The Communist Party had underestimated women, the Western press had overlooked their importance, their male counterparts ignored them, and the women themselves, for the most part, didn't make any demands, even though some, like Barbara Labuda, attempted to do so and felt bitterly rejected by the movement to which they had all dedicated and sacrificed the best years of their lives. And yet, none of the Tygodnik Mazowsza editors are victims. Each of them charged forth into the post-1989 arena to shape prosperous and progressive careers. Some started new families. Almost all of them remained politically engaged. They published. One became the head of a philanthropic foundation. Others worked for Gazeta Wyborcza. But the question that began to be discussed in Poland in 1990 in the pages of Gazeta Wyborcza, and which we might discuss a little further today, is what cost do women pay And what cost does democracy pay when women are not rewarded or fairly represented in the building of a democracy? In fact, in the early stage of my research, I wondered if gender awareness would develop in Poland as the country democratized. That's one of the reasons why I decided to follow these women and their society into the 90s, the new decade of democracy building, because I was interested to see whether and under what conditions these women's leadership roles might become recognized in Poland and perhaps even established in the historical record. And that is what happened indeed. The emergence of democratic practices in the nonprofit sector in the 90s fostered the growth of women's grassroots, women's rights movements across the nation, and gender studies courses at major universities. Feminist publishing and activism gained momentum, fueled by women and men ranging in age from their 20s through their 70s. Gender questions posed new exciting ideas that were starting to penetrate mainstream society. It also helped that Poland was preparing to enter the EU and had to therefore adhere to EU conventions that safeguard against gender discrimination in the workplace. In addition, in 1999, several reports were published by the US State Department, the EU, and the UN Human Rights Commission, which exposed Poland's human rights violations against women as being the country's most serious human rights violations to date. Well, that was a momentous year, 1999, because it marked the 10th anniversary of the '89 revolution. It was also at this time that my own research, previously published in an academic feminist journal called Penn from Krakow, no longer in existence, sparked the first mainstream public debate on women and political power. The debate carried on for 3 consecutive months in major newsprint and broadcast media and helped awaken popular interest in and understanding of gender issues within a political and democratic context. This became the subject of the second narrative I tell in Solidarity's Secret. So the first narrative is I reconstruct how women created the Solidarity Underground in the 80s. And in the second, I report what happened when this national secret becomes public knowledge in Poland after a new generation of feminists and a growing independent media called the country to task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Penn. Excellent speech. So yeah, let's open the floor to questions. Yeah, if you could use the raise hand feature over Zoom, greatly appreciate it. But thank you again for such a wonderful speech. I thought your speech last time was incredible, but now I know, now I see the full effect of it, and it's pretty great. So yeah, anybody?
I could say, I could say add something, unless someone has, oh, there's a hand, Teresa.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nathan's mom, and I
remember.
and I grew up in communism, and I was 18 years old during martial law, and I was wondering, because I remember these days very clearly. I was in a medical school, but I was wondering, who are these women? Were they students? Were they workers? Because traditionally in Poland, by that age, you would either be working, have a family, or be a student. Since they were running newspapers, I figured, I wouldn't have been able to run any newspaper. I couldn't write. I couldn't write professionally. So were they journalists? Who are these women?
Yes, well, it's a very good question. So they're from the 68 generation. And many of them met in high school or in college. And starting in high school, they had these like intellectual circles where they would meet and they would read books, they would read Max Weber, they would study Socialism with the Human Face in Czech Republic. They would understand what human rights meant. And many of them, about half of them came from communist backgrounds. They were known as the red bourgeoisie. Mm-hmm. And so they were critical of their parents. At first they bought into the whole myth, and then they realized that their parents were of a generation, they were just blowing it. for the
Yeah.
society. Okay, so they knew each other, and this is also interesting because it's also shows where there's why gender is not important to them, because they were young men and women who were very close. They had similar educational backgrounds, similar socialization. They went to college, they went to university. They became more awakened about the, in their critiques of communism. And they became, and they were, whether they were in high school or in college during the March 1968, they were all involved. And they were in the demonstrations, they got arrested, or their friends got arrested. A number of them, you didn't have to be just male to be suspended or expelled from university. You didn't have to, men and women, young men and women went to prison, get criminal records, couldn't go back to the university, couldn't go back to work or to find work for a number of years. And so, given their solid education, a number of them went into the underground media of the 1970s, and some of them also had been in linguistics and in Polish Romanticism and in political theory, and so all of that that was like the chemistry of who they were. So they were also having, some of them were getting married and having children. There were a number of them who had toddlers by 1980, 81.
Hard because there was nothing in the stores at that time. Having
Right.
run an organization, that's amazing, actually.
Right.
And the crazy part is that you were right. We didn't know about it. I mean, I was leaving and I didn't even realize that all the activities that we were hearing about were run by women.
Right. Right. And it wasn't just, it's like the 7 women, but they created these networks of women because the men didn't want to, it was like a lot of hard work. It was a lot of logistical work. And the men just didn't want to be bothered. And it was funny, like Eva Kulik used to say, well, the men were staying home and feeling sorry for themselves because they couldn't have demonstrations and strikes. And we were out in the world, we were in the streets, sending messages and distributing the newspaper and stuff like that. We had more freedom than they did.
For sure. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I have a question. Well, I actually have many, but I'll pick and choose. Can you talk a little bit about like Anna Valentinovich, and was she one of the women you interviewed? And if not, how come?
I definitely interviewed her.
Okay.
And she takes up a whole chapter in my book. And other women, I mean, a whole chapter is on women at the gates of the Gdańsk shipyard strikes. And, back in, long before I interviewed her in 84, she gave an interview to Ms. Magazine. And she was so angry then at Wałęsa and the other, and Borusewicz and others from Gdańsk, the male activists from Gdańsk, who didn't let her get involved in any formal way after 1980, after the strikes and the formation of Solidarity. And that was very upsetting to her forever. And she's an interesting figure. I interviewed her in the late 90s. And I had interviewed many other women in Gdańsk who were in the shipyard strikes before I interviewed her. It was just logistically, there were things that made it difficult. And her memory was very good. And I think she's a very important figure and an interesting figure to me because she was naturally charismatic and a good organizer of people. People were really attracted to, she spoke the truth. People felt like she spoke the truth at the shipyard, her fellow workers. And she was, one of the things that worked for her for a while was that she was older. She was called Pani Anya, and she was everyone's mother. And she had that moral authority as a maternal figure to say, this isn't right, guys. We have to and we have to be strong and have the moral courage to say this isn't right. We have to, we need more rights, labor rights. But what happened to her, and this is why the women in Tagatnik Mazasha are an interesting counterpoint, is that Pani Anya was old, relatively. She was only in her 50s, so that seems kind of young to me. She was single by that point, a widow, and she didn't have she didn't have a boyfriend, so she didn't have a circle of support that others like Alina Piankowska had, because she had a boyfriend and she was married, and it helped her, and she was younger. She was of the '68 generation, and she was brought in and kept in, whereas it was very easy to marginalize a woman who was single and too independent and outspoken, like Pani Anya. And she really needed someone to take her, by the hand and say, we want to keep you involved and let's do it this way. Here's the strategy. No one did that for her. She was just pushed aside. What made the women of Tagatnik Mazasha so interesting to me is that there's power in numbers, and you had 7 women working together, so they couldn't be singled out and isolated. And the men really needed them at that time because the men were so vulnerable to being arrested. Can I say something about activist history, or documenting the working in the historical present? So when the media debate broke out in June of 1999 in Poland on the 10th anniversary of the Solidarity Revolution, and it was Warsaw University feminist scholar Agnieszka Graf had written an op-ed in Gazeta Wyborcza in the opinion section and said, we're here celebrating solidarity, but we're only talking about the male heroes, and we're not talking about what women did. And there's interesting research out there by an American feminist on the women's role and gender dynamics and solidarity. Why aren't we looking at women? Why aren't we also celebrating women? And it sparked this media debate. And I was at the time working in Washington, D.C., and friends of mine in Warsaw called and said, you're in trouble. Everyone in Poland is mad at you. And there's a debate going on about your research. And I think what it meant was that the women who had appeared in my book, or at that point it wasn't a book, it was my research. I had one article, published in Penn. But can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, good. I'm trying to find what happened to you. I've lost you on my computer. I've lost the visibility, but that's okay. So they felt like they were being talked about behind their backs, and they didn't know what was going on. And they were nervous that they were going to be mocked. And so I had to reach, and the article and then the continuing media debate had taken me by surprise. So I hadn't known it was going to happen, and they hadn't known. And so I had to call all of them and say, well, maybe this is a good thing. It's stimulating a debate. You should get involved. I'm going to get involved. And that's more or less what happened. Joanna Szczęsna was the main voice of the Solidarity women that I wrote about in the media debate. And then I had a chance to get involved too. And it was exciting. It was so exciting to see for the first time in the mainstream media that questions about discrimination against women were being discussed, and they weren't being mocked. They were being taken seriously. Of course, it helped that there were the human rights violations report by the UN State Department, U.S. State Department, and the EU. So that helped justify and legitimize that there is such a thing as gender discrimination, and we should start to take it seriously. Plus, Polish people had lived now for 10 years in a democracy and had started to see that there's glass ceilings at work, and in politics, and they were starting to feel like some of this language about discrimination was making sense. So that was exciting to be a part of. Okay, someone had a question?
Yeah, I see
Stop.
Misha has a question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for being with us today. I have a question about the current situation. Maybe you know, what is the status of women in Poland today, and are the deeds of many numerous women that you described to us of solidarity movement recognized in Poland today, following your research?
Okay, so are they yes, they are recognized today, I'm proud to say. And every time there's an anniversary, they are interviewed, and there have been different journals coming out in Polish. There are a couple of books, but it's mainly articles in journals like Karta, which is the Kartas, the archive of the opposition, and of other World War II also. Politica magazine writes about the women. There aren't memoirs, but there are a lot of essays and profiles of the women. And the other part of the question, Misha, sorry.
Yes, what is the status of women in Poland today? Because we know it's a traditional patriarchal society to a large extent, but also there's a lot of reformist movement recently.
Right. Well, there's you remember the Women's March from October 2020 that went into 2021. The government is very traditional in its values, and it has tried to restrict women's reproductive rights as much as possible. It makes fun, it decries the use of the concept gender, and does other things. It's mainly, I'd say, probably, while it's discriminatory against women, it discriminates the most against people who are gay. And I would say that's the hardest. That's probably the most prejudiced that we can find the government to be. But women are not, women are fighting back. Women are protesting. We've seen these incredible protests all across the country, nationwide in October, where I mean, truck drivers and even some of the local police were joining the women in their demonstrations that went on 24/7 during the pandemic. So it's I would say the situation is dynamic. There's a strong push to repress women. On the other hand, women have been free too long to be repressed, and it's, I think there's just going to be battles like this going on for a long time.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I have more, but before I ask, I want to. Okay, yeah. Mom, you're muted.
I didn't even know. I just wanted to add one thing here about the current situation. Sometimes I think that we had more freedom during communism than we have now, because with the Catholic Church regaining power and pushing that archaic role of women back down our throats that we really don't want to accept, is causing a lot of problems. And I don't think it will be accepted by the new generation. They will fight back until it's over. But yeah, that's one thing that sometimes I regret the communist felt, because I really did feel that we had more rights back then, because communism was built on the assumption that everybody's equal.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, I sometimes feel that way too. It's just all so much more confusing and problematic now.
yeah.
Yeah. So it looks like maybe we have time for one more question before it hits the hour, or Shayna, do you want to wrap things up?
No, I'm eager. I'm happy to hear another question.
Okay.
It's earlier here than it is where you are.
Yes, true. I guess I'm curious. I'm just picking and choosing I have like 8 questions on my notepad. So do you think these women, like the female leaders of solidarity, do you think that they resent the men, the male solidarity leaders, for getting the credit that they never got?
Yeah, actually, the only one who seems to be bitter about that is Barbara Labuda, and she got over it. But no, the other women felt like they went on to do what they wanted to do, and even and they're all powerful in their own right in their work. And listen, if I were in their positions, I might not have gone into politics either. But had the dynamics been different and they weren't, and they had been encouraged to get involved, we would have a different scenario. It was that they were, intentionally excluded. Oh, you don't really want to do this. Just let the men do it. There's not enough to go. There are not enough places to go around for everyone.
All right. Then I just see that someone else raised their hand. Alex.
It is wonderful to see you again, Ms. Penn. My question is, if there's any lesson that, women today, even men today, can take away from women during the solidarity movement, what can we learn from them?
That's such a nice question. That social change doesn't happen overnight. It requires deep conviction to want to change anything. And you don't, it's like you put your hat in and you don't really know where things are going to go, but you're both leading it and following the forces at the same time, and that you can't do it yourself. They worked as a team, even though it was clear that Helena was their leader. But that social change doesn't happen overnight. Usually takes 10 years for something to really move and change. And they were in it for the long haul. They figured they were in it for their lifetime. And right now, I think in terms of what they have to offer us right now, we may be having to see that ourselves, that we're, to see our world come back together in some humane way it's going to take time, and we can't, if we care, we should think about how to be active and where to put ourselves.
I think that was a great question to end things on.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Shayna, for your time, for your wisdom, and for sharing everything with us today. And thank you also for taking the initiative and putting all the years, I think you said 10 years worth of hard work into writing this book. If it wasn't for you, as you also mentioned, I think this unfortunately would have never made it into the history books, and it's incredibly important. So I think I think I speak for everybody when I say that we're all very grateful for you and your work.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Wonderful to see you again.
Okay, great to see you again too. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yes. Until then, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Leaders,
Bye.
if your club could stick around for an extra 30 seconds, I would greatly appreciate that.
Okay, bye.
Bye.